Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 25th of April and today's video will be very informative. We're going to split it up into three parts. We'll begin by looking at Frontline updates, some of which originate from Donetsk, but the majority of the updates from the past 24 hours are from the Kursk and Sumy regions respectively. We do have some Russian advances over there that are rather interesting. But besides that, I want to look at the assassination of Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskalik that occurred today. He was deputy chief of the main operations directorate of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. So we'll look at his story, his role in Russian politics and foreign policy over the past 10 years, and how basically the Ukrainians were able to pull off this operation. We'll also look at the negotiation proposals by the United States delegation led by Steve Witkoff, and also the proposals that were returned by the Ukrainian and European delegations. So we'll look at where the US, EU, Ukraine sort of have some sort of parallel agreements with one another. And then we'll also look at the disagreements and the viability of Russia actually agreeing to some of those proposals. Because as we all know, Steve Witkoff actually met with Putin today, likely to discuss his perspective and his draft proposal, and then also to look at some of the points that were brought up by Ukraine and the Europeans during their response, because all of the drafts that were released to the public by Reuters, they were initially transmitted to either party. That was Wednesday when that occurred. So 2 days ago, April 23rd. But let's begin by zooming in on the frontline updates. And if you guys enjoy this sort of in-depth content on the war in Ukraine, and now we're going to begin expanding into the political scene with the negotiations, then please share the video, like, and subscribe so we can get past the algorithm's restrictions. But let's begin over here with frontline updates. Not necessarily this one, but actually just one north of Andrivka. So you can see over here that the Russians were able to capture another 50 hectares. So Deep State and numerous other Ukrainian sources have actually been pretty late to reporting on Russian advances that are occurring north of this town. They've left a really large swath of territory marked as a gray zone, when in actuality, for the past month or even longer than that, it's been under pretty firm Russian control. So in the process of now Deep State finally updating their map to give us a better idea of where the actual demarcation line is, they also showed us that the Russians were able to advance even further past the line that I had previously imagined. So you can see that's why there is that yellow polygon marked on the map. But we know for sure the Russians have a presence in this region based on a lot of videos that came out from Ukrainian units like the 35th Marine Brigade. It's one of the main units involved in operations over here, targeting Russian columns that were trying to exploit the open fields and lack of trenches to conduct large-scale armored assaults. For the time being, the Ukrainians do still retain control over this salient. It is large in size, although the Ukrainians, they can't really man it to the brim because, again, it's very exposed. Logistics over here in this 21 square kilometer region are very difficult to sustain. But it is an area that the Ukrainians would like to drag out the fighting in for as long as possible, because it sort of acts as a buffer between the Russian flanks, the northern flanks, and then positions in Oleksivka and generally every single highway and every single village running along the Vavcha River all the way to the Donetsk-Dnipro border. But moving on to another parts of this Dnipro direction that recently has seen some movement, just north of Nadivka, you have over here an advance by the Russian side amounting to nearly 2 square kilometers of territory, or actually 1.4 square kilometers. We have a geolocation from April 24th of the unit that was involved in this being the 27th Motor Rifle Division. I don't know which specific regiment or brigade, but the division as a whole is one of the key, facet organization points that is, pushing forward with the offensive activity over here. So they utilize at least 3 vehicles to advance and to take over additional territory. From a vertical perspective, they were able to advance around 2.2 kilometers northwards, and they also use FPVs to strike Ukrainian vehicles that were operating nearby and hit at least 4 of them, along with just hitting numerous Ukrainian positions in these open fields. So the Russian objective over here is to stretch out the Ukrainians to create new potential vectors of advance to squeeze out the remaining resistance that is occurring near these trenches and warehouses, because frontal assaults so far have not been fruitful. They've not been able to achieve their desired outcomes. So the Ukrainians do still have this sort of center of gravity over here that's preventing the Russians from shifting their full force and full focus to the fields northwards and basically to the Solana River. So Nadivka really is important for that region, for that reason, because it really is helping maintain continuity along the front line for the Ukrainian side. And that's why the Russians are expanding their horizons and trying to chip away at it from the north. And it is definitely connected to what's going on in Uspanivka right now, because the Russians understand that frontal assaults, even if they succeed in eventually clearing out Uspanivka, will really play out in a similar fashion in nearby villages like Novoserhivka or Novoalexandrivka. And so the Russians would prefer to open up a front to the south, open up assaults over here, and create a flanking maneuver. And that would occur in tandem with Russian direct assaults coming in from the east. So for the time being, this plan is still in its infancy. We haven't seen the full scale of these advances. And actually, to a certain degree, the Ukrainians have actually been able to make up ground in Uspanivka. The fighting over here has really been characterized by back and forth pushes. But at a certain point within, like, I don't know, like early parts of the month, it became pretty clear that the Russians were largely in control of the village. But now, ever since the Easter ceasefire, we've gotten indications that the Ukrainians are actually present in the western half of this hamlet, and they have been able to hold on to that line. We have a geolocation of this is from April 21st of the Russians shelling central Uspanivka, so that gives us a pretty good indicator of what's going on over here. And that means that the Ukrainians have been able to stymie any further Russian penetrations over here, opening up the possibility for flanks occurring to the south. Now, to move on, I want to focus not on the Kalinova region because we don't actually have any significant updates from over there, but let's look at Kharkiv because there is just a minor development over there. So we have this geolocation. This is from April 25th. So the 14th Mechanized Brigade, they use FPVs to hit two Russian vehicles, and also conducted grenade drops onto Russian dismounted infantry. They were located near tree lines and along this local road that then pushes westwards all the way to the entrance of Petropavlivka, and then from there into the eastern suburbs of Kupiansk. So it is an important road that the Russians are now advancing through. But for the most part, the intensity of assaults over here is rather minuscule on a day-to-day basis. There obviously is a lot of artillery shelling and pressure through various means of firepower, but actual advances along the front line, they are rather slim over here. And even when they do occur, it's not enough to change the situation too much over here, because if we're looking at the situation along this sort of like eastern buffer of Kupiansk, the Russians are advancing through areas that actually aren't that dense in trenches, and even in those locations, the pace of their attacks and gains are rather small. And that means that once they eventually do reach several lines of trenches where you do have prepared positions that were set up by the forces of the 14th Brigade or several adjacent units, they will be more prepared and dug in to push back against that, so the resistance could actually increase with time. And so just advancing from the east to the west towards the suburbs of Kupiansk is something that is extremely difficult. And it's a part of why we just haven't seen any initiative taken to try to embark upon those attempts. And as a result, the casualties over here aren't really that high either. And that's also why the Russians, in the first place, opened up the Oskil River bridgehead in part in order to change the tactical situation around Kupiansk, but also to stretch out Ukrainian forces. But for the time being, the Oskil River bridgehead has basically been stabilized, and we haven't seen too many significant advances over there recently. When it comes to Kursk, this is what I really wanted to discuss today. We do have footage from the entrance to Oleshnia indicating that the Russian forces are now entering into the village. So you can see this is from April 25th, the 95th Air Assault Brigade, which we just talked about yesterday as being a new member of the 8th Assault Corps. They are operating over here in tandem with the 82nd and 80th Air Assault Brigades. So they conducted grenade drop operations. They hit 3 Russian vehicles, and they also hit soldiers that dismounted and entered into houses in northern Oleshnia, meaning that the village is now officially in a gray zone. The Russians are within striking distance of the international border over here, only about 800 meters away. And now that it's contested, there are no Ukrainian villages in Kursk that are fully under their control. It's only Gornal and Oleshnia that are contested at the moment. And with the momentum currently based on these pieces of footage, we can say that the Russians will be able to take it back in the near future. You could see that the extent of the advance amounts to 2.4 square kilometers of territory, And really, the next objective for the Russians will be to take control of the entire trench line that was built adjacent to the border with Ukraine. That was constructed during the Surovikin era, and it is actually really well built when it comes to the, width and the structure with, various different layers. I suppose in some areas the dragon's teeth over here wasn't sufficient, but in terms of actual land work, it is good. The issue when the Ukrainians broke through, obviously, was the lack of manpower that was holding on to those trenches. But now that could change given the really large amount of Russian forces deployed to the Kursk region during the sort of height of the operation and the culmination of Russian advances. It was like 70,000. Maybe now it's a bit less due to movement of forces back to other parts of the front line, like Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar, for instance. But the garrison is still really large. I could see being over 60,000 over here, and they could be involved in shaping operations 10 kilometers deep into Sumy in order to create a security zone, and that will also include the highway that sort of passes the north of Voleshnia and from there connects to an area like Kivka and even deeper into Sumy. But for the time being, the only advance that we've noted out of Sumy over the past 24 hours is in Zhuravka. So now the entirety of the village has been taken over by the Russian side. You can see over here the gains amounted to nearly 2 square kilometers. We have a geolocation from the Alcor drone units. This is a drone unit, a part of the 116th Mechanized Brigade. So their FPV strikes, they hit Russians that were hiding in basements and dugouts. And actually, it's Territorial Defense Brigade. The 116th Brigade is a different unit entirely, but that's neither here nor there. The Russians were hiding in basements and dugouts over here, and they were spotted by the drone crew and targeted accordingly. But based on that, we know that the Russians were able to advance along what is that, the Snehirsk River, and they were able to push southwards 1.3 kilometers, meaning they are advancing along this key road that will give them access to Bilovodi, which is another nearby village. And you can see how now a lot of these Russian advances could end up connecting. These sort of separate vectors are now beginning to culminate into one singular Russian presence within Sumy. So that will include the advance from Vasilivka and then Shurovka and then Basivka. And then the front line would sort of, connect together around Loknaya and Bolovodi. And from there, the Russians would be in a position to begin expanding depending on which areas are most favorable from a topographic standpoint, or an area that would be considered weak due to a lack of troop deployments, or maybe just a key road that could be capitalized upon to push further southwards. But again, the overarching goal right now for the Russians with their parallel attacks would be to eventually reach Unakivka, which is going to be difficult because the Ukrainians over here also have a pretty large density. Before the fall of the Kursk region, the Ukrainians had, between 35 to 40,000 troops in this general region, and I would say the number is pretty similar, although it is smaller due to deployments to Belgorod and then also to other parts of the front line. Maybe 30,000, we could say. And they're really densely situated around Unikivka and then also around nearby clusters like Miropirlia. That's a good example. And so they now have a logistical situation which is not as horrid as it was during the Kursk debacle, although it is still difficult because there aren't that many roads, and the roads that do connect to these key pillars of Ukrainian defense, like Unikivka, as I said, they are very exposed to Russian bombardment on a daily basis. So that's just something to keep in mind. But let's move on to the other story for today. I want to look at the assassination of the deputy chief of the main operations directorate, as we said, of the general staff of the Russian forces. So his name is Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskalik, and he was assassinated in a suburb just to the east of Moscow. We have the geolocation for that as well. So you can see it was in the city of Balashikha. So this is from today. In the morning, he was leaving his apartment and he passed near a car. The car was mined with VOG 17 grenades and it exploded as it was passing by, killing him instantly. And the suspect that I've seen mentioned by Russian channels, and I can't verify this, but what's being said, and obviously I'll update if I get this wrong, is that it's a man that goes by the name of Ignat Kuzhin, and he is actually a Ukrainian-born national that was living in Russia. And there are actually a lot of these Ukrainian-born nationals. I don't know if it's in the hundreds of thousands or millions. I know that in general, Ukrainians living in Russia, based on like Ukrainian ancestry, is in the millions. But I don't know if actual like people that were born within the state boundaries of Ukraine today, living in Russia is in the millions, or if it's in the hundreds of thousands. But in any case, the amount is significant, and so then it's easier for the GUR to establish connections with those sort of people. And then those Ukrainian nationals living in Russia, they would obviously have the ability to spy on generals on a daily basis to keep track of their locations. So that is what this individual did. So he tracked the routine of this general for about a month, and he rented out a house nearby or an apartment. I'm not sure, and based on that, he was able to, situate everything in time and get all the infrastructure in place to conduct this sort of explosion. And he was the only person killed. There was like damage, property damage, like windows exploding nearby, but that's about it. So this is a really significant assassination, and it is very similar to another assassination that took place also in the Moscow region, I believe, and it occurred to this general by the name of Igor Kirillov. He was the head of the CBRN defense administration that the Russians have, and he was killed by an electric scooter exploding as he was passing by, and that was in December of 2024. So the Ukrainians, and a lot of it is coming from their intelligence apparatus, have been able to establish links not just with the Ukrainians, but also with Central Asians and various other, I suppose, resistance figures that are in opposition to the current government in Russia. And based on that network, they've been able to, keep track of certain figures that they would view as high value targets, and then are able to take them out in these sort of IED based assassinations. So this is one of the most significant ones of the entire war because he was involved in the main operations directorate. Think of that. The general staff has a body, the main administrative body that is involved with like the planning, the operational planning of the military's actions, and he's the deputy chief of that. So you could imagine how much of a vital role that really is. He's one of the most senior Russians within the entire general staff in general, and he was very important over the past 10 years within the Russian foreign policy sphere. So he was involved in 2015 in the Normandy format, which was, of course, the talks that were associated with the Minsk agreements and the Minsk Protocol 2 being signed in 2015. So he was one of the Russian representatives, and he was also involved in talks in 2017 with Turkey and Iran to basically come to a settlement regarding the Syrian civil war. So he's been really important as just a representative and liaison for the Russians to talk about negotiations. And perhaps had he survived, he could have been a big sort of factor and player in the current round of negotiations between the US, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians with the Russian side. But now he is dead, and I believe that the Russians, from their perspective, they're going to have to find a way to change the daily routine and the security protocols that their own high value targets have in order to prevent these sort of similar incidents from occurring more and more frequently. Because I believe that the Ukrainians, with the infrastructure they have in place, the intelligence assets that they've been able to use to infiltrate into Russia, they're going to really not stop anytime soon. They might actually even ramp up these sort of assassinations and succeed given the sort of potency of their intelligence apparatus. And so it's going to be obviously incumbent upon the Russians to do something to prevent that in order to guard the secrecy of the location of these sort of forces of these generals. And on the flip end, the Russians don't really use the similar sort of modus operandi for assassinating high level officials. There are airstrikes that or sometimes just generally throughout the course of the war, certain incidents that just by chance lead to the deaths of high ranking Ukrainian officials, but nothing of the sort. And part of that is due to Russia's security conception and the way in which they decide to operate the war, and the fact that assassinating singular figures in leadership, if it's not a decapitation strike that takes out the entirety of leadership and leads to discombobulation of the military apparatus, or I suppose the political apparatus as well, if it's not something like that, then it wouldn't actually make a major difference in the front line in general. So that's a part of the thinking for why the Russians don't do this. It's just they're very, very, um, you know, sort of accustomed manner of just engaging in the war and in a systematic process rather than having these high value assassinations in Kiev. And then also from an intelligence perspective, the Russian security services and intel agencies have probably not infiltrated into Ukrainian society in the same way that the Ukrainians have been able to do recently, just due to the lack of interest in investment. And then also because the Ukrainians do have hundreds of thousands of potential candidates to do so, whereas now the situation for I suppose, the Russian side may be a bit more difficult to obtain those sort of agents. Although it does still happen. I'm just saying that the Ukrainians do it more than the Russians do. And now to end off the video, I do want to look at the proposals that were laid out by the US delegation and then also the joint Ukrainian European delegations. These were presented during the talks between both sides in Paris on April 17th. So Reuters obtained this, and you could see over here, I'm going to read off the key points and then I'll explain the differences between both proposals that I'm going to read. But first of all, this is coming from Steve Woodcock and from the American side. This is their plan, their final plan, as they put it, for a sustainable peace in Ukraine. And Trump was very clear about this, that he wanted to receive a positive response from both sides, lest he just leave the negotiating in total and just sort of abandon Ukraine, not even try to get involved in the issue for the next 4 years. So I'm going to explain this proposal. So this is the condition that was first laid out: a permanent ceasefire. So that includes, of course, land, sea, and air, and then immediate negotiations starting, talks between both sides opening up. That's something that is basically agreed upon by all sides in this sort of peace negotiation. The fact that ceasefire has to be the first thing to happen. Besides that, the Ukrainians will receive security guarantees, but not from the United States, and they will be rather vague. They will come from European nations. They could be a grouping of not just European nations, but basically any nation that's willing to do so. But the United States is not actually going to be willing to commit to that sort of thing. So that's going to be a big source of friction between the US and Ukrainian side, because the Ukrainians actually are insisting on American involvement and they want to see this sort of Article 5 esque guarantee of security, which is something that they want to see from the American side. They want to basically get that in return for not joining into NATO, because within the Ukrainian EU proposal, they say that there's no consensus yet about whether Ukraine should join into NATO. So they're basically like having this tacit admission that Ukraine won't join NATO, but in return they would like that the United States have some sort of similar mechanism for guaranteeing Ukraine security. And the US proposal doesn't mention that at all. They mention the Europeans and other like minded nations providing that sort of guarantee instead. So that's going to be one of the number one sources of friction, in addition to now what we're going to see as well, this being territory. Besides that, the US proposal says Ukraine cannot join NATO, but that they could join the EU. So that's something that is common ground. Territory. So the United States will, by law, recognize that Russia controls Crimea. Again, the sort of de facto, de jure thing doesn't necessarily matter that much. It's more so about where the line of contact will be demarcated at when the ceasefire actually comes into effect. That's what matters more than whether by law the U.S. recognizes it. That doesn't really have much of an effect. But de facto, the U.S. would also recognize Russian control over all of Luhansk. And by the way, there's still like 1% of Luhansk that is under Ukrainian control. So just as a funny sort of side note, I wonder what would happen to that, whether the Ukrainians would be mandated to leave these final villages like Kharkivka over here and Tverdokhlyi Bove. That's something that I find rather interesting. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not that important. The US would also provide de facto recognition of the Russian controlled parts of Kherson, meaning the areas marked in red over here. Also, Russian controlled parts of Zaporozhye and Donetsk, meaning that the Ukrainian controlled parts, like this part of Kherson and this part of Zaporozhye, this location in Donetsk, would remain under Ukrainian control, and they would obviously still be sovereign over there. Now, the Ukrainians would actually regain control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. You could see it over here in Enerhodar, and it would be taken over with U.S. control and administration of the plant. Electricity would be distributed to both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, and the same thing would apply to the Kakhovka Dam, meaning that the Ukrainians would have control over it, but both sides would receive the benefits of the dam, and the U.S. would be there as a mediator. And the Ukrainians will also receive unhindered passage to the Dnipro River, basically having the ability to move their economic or transits or military resources through the Dnieper River, and they would do so uh, really with control of the Kinburn Spit. So the Kinburn Spit is currently under Russian control, and you can see that the Kinburn Spit actually just spans about 10 kilometers. This chunk of territory over here, and based on the American proposal, it would come under Ukrainian control in order to ensure that the Ukrainians have control of the passageway that leads into the Dniprovska Gulf and vice versa into the Black Sea. When it comes to the economic side of the deal, the US and the Ukrainians will implement their economic cooperation and minerals agreement. And so far, it's been announced so many times that the agreement will be signed by Trump. And then, for whatever reason, the Ukrainian side really gets cold feet and never ends up agreeing to it. I think there is ambiguity and a lack of understanding of what the both sides want to achieve with the minerals deal at this point, because the Ukrainians don't want to sign anything that will say that their previous aid that they received from the US would be considered like a debt that they have to repay. So that's a red line for them. They would definitely not accept anything like that. And even if they agree to a more milk toast version of the deal, where it's just like the U.S. helping fund like a fund and a trust that could extract resources and then they could share the profits, that's also not going to be too popular with a lot of Ukrainian businessmen and oligarchs that would prefer to siphon off the profits for themselves rather than American companies and American financial instruments coming into Ukraine. So I believe that's probably part of the thinking as well, and also the conditions potentially, just siphoning off away Ukraine sovereignty. So that's something that Ukraine Zelensky might be worried about. Might be worried about sort of the optics around it. And so far, as a result, the deal has not been signed, even though Trump has said numerous times that he's about to get the deal done. And actually, even though the Ukrainians under the American plan will not receive any security guarantees, the fact that an economic cooperation agreement even exists in the first place would, in effect, be a sort of guarantee, because it would give the United States a permanent foothold within Ukraine based on deep economic ties, and it would actually give the U.S. an interest in defending Ukraine. And so then there's an argument to be had from an American perspective, whether that's even something that is positive in the first place, because it would tie down the U.S. for decades now to the fate of Ukraine. But then from a Ukrainian perspective, that actually could be something favorable and could be a silver lining within this entire ceasefire negotiation. Based on the terms, the economic terms that Steve Witkoff laid out, Ukraine would be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, although a mechanism was not listed. They did not list whether they wanted to do this using frozen Russian assets. So keep an eye out for what they sort of plan to do in that sort of angle. Maybe it will just end up coming from the European nations themselves, and also in return for all this, sanctions on Russia that sort of resulted from the conflict in the first place ever since 2014 would be removed. And that would be, of course, a big win for the Russian side. And it would also come with U.S. Russian economic cooperation on energy and industrial sectors. So this would mean that the Americans would have deep financial ties, both with the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. So that's the proposal that was set up by Steve Witkoff, and the European and Ukrainian counterproposal is different on several key points. So it was presented to the US April 23rd during negotiations in London. So one of the common points is that there would just be an immediate ceasefire to basically everything, land, sea, air, and that both sides would get into immediate negotiations. And this would be done with American and European participation, and that would be a part of the general framework for eventually getting to a lasting peace. And there would be ceasefire monitoring led by the U.S. and supported by third parties. Then something that is mentioned here that was not mentioned by Witkoff in the EU proposal is that the Russians must unconditionally return all Ukrainian children that are living within Russia, and that there would be some all-for-all prisoner of war return swap policy. There would also be security guarantees for the Ukrainian side. And this is something that I mentioned before, that instead of NATO membership, because in the proposal there's no consensus among the NATO countries of whether Ukraine should get NATO membership or not. So in its stead, the U.S. would provide the Ukrainians with a security guarantee, which would be similar to NATO's Article 5. And so that's something to really unpack, because would that mean that the United States would have to get militarily involved with boots on the ground, or the Air Force or the Navy, in case the Russians broke the ceasefire and attacked the Ukrainians? Or would it just mean that the United States would be obligated to give significant amounts of aid to the Ukrainian side? That's something that was not really hashed out over here, but that's an extremely important point that has to be, further calibrated, because that could be a huge sort of change to American policy regarding Ukraine if the U.S. were to agree to that, which they won't. They definitely won't. I'm telling you guys from the beginning now that that's a major point of friction, and that the United States will never agree to that level of involvement. The sort of economic deal with the cooperation with minerals is the most that Ukraine will get. When it comes to the Ukrainian military, there will be no restrictions on the armed forces of Ukraine. The states that are involved in essentially ensuring Ukraine's sovereignty and security would form an ad hoc grouping, and they would be European countries and other adjacent countries. I don't know, it could be New Zealand, Australia, etc. And they would have a presence within Ukraine, and there would be no restriction on the amount of foreign soldiers and foreign weapons that could come into Ukraine to help further arm the country. And then Ukraine would join the EU. So that's the security side. When it comes to territory, the territorial issue was not fully hashed out in the Ukrainian European proposal. They said that territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. This leaves the door open for Russia to retain control over certain parts of Ukrainian territory. So, from the get go, the Ukrainians are not necessarily demanding that all of the territory that they lost since 2022 or 2014 be returned to them. So, that is a bit of a shift when it comes to Ukraine's policy, which has been very steadfast up until now. And the territorial negotiations would start on the basis of the current line of contact, meaning that the absolute best case scenario from a Russian perspective in regards to what Ukraine's proposing would be to keep control of whatever they currently have control over. So that's something to keep in mind. In addition to that, this is something that's similar between the U.S. and Ukrainian proposals. So here it would be that the Ukrainians regain control over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with American involvement. Same thing with the Kakhovka Dam. The Ukrainians would have unhindered access to the Dnieper River via control of the Kinburn Spit, as we said before. And then from an economic standpoint, the U.S. and Ukraine would implement the economic cooperation and minerals agreement, and Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially via Russia's sovereign assets. So those 300 billion, I believe dollars, not euros, dollars in sovereign assets that are being held largely in European banks, some of it being held in the American collection, but largely being held in Brussels, would be released and utilized to help rebuild Ukraine under this proposal. So they actually have a specific mechanism for how to rebuild, in contrast to the American proposal. Uh, that would and then basically the remaining sovereign assets that the Russians have that are currently being held by the EU, they would remain frozen until the Russians compensate the damages to Ukraine. And so it's just sort of a roundabout way of using the frozen assets to help rebuild Ukraine. And yeah, U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014, they could be gradually eased, but only after a sustainable peace is realized in the eyes of obviously the mediators. And then they could be immediately snapped back if there is some sort of understanding that the Russians are violating the ceasefire. So you can see how different it is, and how the Russians, based on their positions that they've made clear about where they want the line of contact to be, which territories they want to annex, the sort of security guarantees that they would prefer that Ukraine not have with other countries. They would support just a complete Ukrainian neutrality in a post-war scenario. All of those factors mean that a European proposal, such as the one that we saw laid out over here, is not realistic. And really, the more realistic route, even though I'm not confident at all about the chances of it, the more realistic one is obviously the American one. But I'd like to see, obviously, how the talk with Witkoff and Putin went today, because they probably talked about the Steve Witkoff proposal, and I'd like to see how he responded to that. And then on the flip side, how would Zelensky respond to having to, abide by the conditions, territorial conditions, NATO conditions that were laid out by Witkoff in his proposal? That's something that's still unknown, and it could change over time. But for the time being, that's all we know. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.